Today, we'll be painting the Word-Bearer's Vorbak. This painting guide will demonstrate the simple, repeatable techniques I use to quickly paint large Horus Heresy armies. I've had my eye on this Forge World kit for a decade, but it was the recent Siege of Chthoniya narrative campaign series that finally prompted me to start a Word-Bearer's army and gave me the perfect opportunity to finally paint some Vorbak. This multi-part resin kit was sculpted by Steve Whitehead and released by Forge World in 2014. The models are well cast, with minimal mold lines and flashing. Each smaller part corresponds to a specific body, and you can easily match them by looking at the letters on the casting blocks. For example, this particular model is paired by the letter B. The Vorbak are imposing models, with their scale and proportions fitting nicely alongside the newer, larger-scale plastic marines. We'll be modifying these models slightly by removing the serrated sun chapter markings, as we're representing the flayed hand chapter that was present on Chthoniya during the late Heresy. I begin by carefully removing all mold lines, flashing, and serrated sun markings. Later, we'll apply chapter transfers to complete the look. With the models now assembled, they're ready for painting. The sculpts are excellent and loaded with intricate details and character. Even 10 years later, these are some of the best sculpts ever produced for the Horus Heresy. I begin with a prime of Chaos black spray, ensuring full coverage on all sides. This creates a solid foundation for the paint. Next, I airbrush the first base of Citadel Air Vorbak red. Once that's done, I follow up with a second base coat of Citadel Air Word-Bearer's red to achieve a rich red armor. The red may look a little bright at this stage, but it will be washed down later. Using Cadian flesh tone and a medium brush, I begin by carefully blocking in all areas of exposed skin and sinew on the model. Once the flesh tones are completed, I move on to Abaddon black, focusing on the weapons, shoulder pauldrons, and any other areas requiring a black base. Next, I switch to Citadel Leadbelcher to paint all of the silver metallic parts like weapon details, cabling, and armor joints. I then use Eshin Gray and do a loose highlight over our weapons and do a subtle dry brush over our black pauldrons. Next, I apply Xandri dust as the base layer for all the bone, teeth, claws, and parchment. Be sure to take your time on this step. It's easy to miss small teeth and claws scattered across the model. With the main layers blocked in, I use Word-Bearer's red to touch up any areas where the paint may have slipped. I also blend the transitions between armor and flesh, smoothing out the areas where the two meet for a more organic look. Using Nuln Oil Shade, I wash down all the red armor, black shoulder pauldrons, knee pads, and silver metallics. This helps define the details and darkens the red down to that iconic Word-Bearer's crimson. Once the wash is dry, I move on to Kislev Flesh for the second layer of skin tone, focusing on highlighting raised areas for a subtle contrast. I then switch to Ushabti Bone to add a second layer over all the teeth, claws, bone, and parchment. Returning to Abaddon Black, I carefully paint the scripture on all the parchment. Using the same brush from earlier, I make sure to apply a small amount of paint, just to the tip of the bristles for precision. People often think you need a small brush for this, but really you just need a fine point and the right amount of paint. Using White Scar, I apply highlights to all the flesh tones, parchment, teeth, claws, and bone. Don't worry if the white looks a bit too bright at this point. It will blend in with the next steps. When highlighting the parchment, you can even go over the scripture. The writing will still show through the white paint. Next, I use Reikland Flesh Shade to wash over the flesh, bone, parchment, claws, and teeth. This wash will tone down the highlights, bringing out the fine details and unifying these areas with the armor, which we previously washed with Nuln Oil. Using Ironbreaker again, I apply a fine sponge weathering effect over the armor to simulate recent battle damage. It's crucial not to overdo this step. The smaller and more subtle the weathering, the better. If the sponge marks are too large, it can distort the model's perceived scale, making it look off. Next, I use Corn Red for a sponge weathering effect to simulate blood, aiming to capture the painful transformation into a Vorbak, similar to the reference in the color plate. As with the previous weathering, I keep the application small and subtle. This layer represents dried blood, and we'll be adding a second layer of fresher gore at the very end. Using Caliban Green, I paint the first layer on the eyes and eye lenses. I then follow up with Warboss Green for a highlight, adding depth and vibrancy to the eyes. The single Gal Vorbak with tainted talons features flames emerging from his armor. To create the flames, I start by painting the entire area with Wraithbone. Next, I apply Aerial Yellow at the base of the flames. I then mix Aerial Yellow and Corn Red to create an orange, which I use for the middle section of the flames. Finally, I finish with Corn Red at the tips to complete the effect. For the transfers, I'll be adding the flayed hand chapter symbols to the right shoulder pauldrons. Additionally, I'll incorporate a mix of gold geometric shapes and runes in random open areas of the armor to add some visual interest. I begin by applying a small amount of water or Walther's Solvaset to the target area. Then, I use a brush to lift the transfer into place. To position it perfectly, I carefully manipulate the transfer with my hobby knife. I repeat this process for all the transfers, ensuring they fully dry before applying another layer of Solvaset over the top to secure them snugly onto the model. Once the transfers have fully dried, it's time to base the models. Using PVA glue and an old brush, I apply the glue over the entire base, being careful not to get any on the model's feet. Next, I dip the model into a fine gravel and sand mix, shaking off any excess. I use my thumb to clean up the edges of the base. With the sand in place, I allow the glue to dry completely before moving on to the next basing steps. Starting with Dryad Bark, I generously paint over all the sand. This not only serves as a base color, but also seals the sand in place. Once the Dryad Bark dries, I use Mournfang Brown for the first dry brush over the sand. Next, I apply Ushabti Bone for a second highlight on the gravel. To blend the colors together, I wash the gravel with Reikland Flesh Shade, which tones down the highlights and unifies the basing colors. Finally, I finish the bases by painting the rims with Steel Legion Drab, typically requiring 2 layers for complete coverage. I then apply weathering powders and dust to the base and the lower sections of the model's legs. This adds a more realistic look and helps blend the model into the base, creating the effect of minor dust kicked up over their armor as they traverse the battlefield. After applying the weathering powders, I use Tester's Dull Coat to fully seal the models. This provides a consistent finish, secures the powders in place, and protects the models for use as game pieces. Now we reach the final stage, the one I've been eagerly anticipating, the second layer of gore. I use Blood for the Blood God to apply a fine sponge weathering effect over the areas where the flesh transitions into armor. This layer dries to resemble recent wet blood, further enhancing the model's painful transformation into a Gal Vorbak. Our Gal Vorbak are now complete and ready to carry out the bidding of the ruinous powers. I'd love to hear your thoughts on which other models you'd like to see me paint, and what campaign, exemplary battle, or event should be the focus of the next series after Chthonian. Thanks for watching.